Welcome to Sports Night in Quarantine. I'm Delaney Barrow, and today I'm joined by Amanda Warren. Amanda is a member of the Weagle radio station. She is a Camp War Eagle counselor, and she's also the director of game day experience for SGA. Amanda, like I said, you're a Camp War Eagle counselor this year, and orientation was all online this year. How did that transition work out for you?
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. I want to do a plug to the first year experience staff because they literally had to turn it around in an insane amount of time. The fact that they were able to switch it all to modules in like pretty short amount of time was like so impressive. Um, it was obviously different. We were also sort of like the guinea pigs of a lot of other offices on campus just because everyone was sort of looking at Camp Were Able to see how that was going to go online. But I'm really proud of all of us and like what we were able to do because it was literally one of those things where if session one had been a total train wreck, then they just would have moved it all online and there wouldn't have been any sort of Zoom interaction or anything. I definitely am a Zoom pro now. Ask me any questions about Zoom. I can answer them for you. But I just hope that we were able to, be welcoming and warm and exciting to the freshmen, even though the fall semester is going to look a little different than they expected, and just be reassuring to them. But I think we did the best with what we could. And I'm really proud of the office and all we were able to do.
That's awesome that you guys were able to make that transition, and hopefully you also help the incoming freshmen get adjusted to potentially online classes this semester, which hopefully that will not happen, but we have to be prepared for anything at this point. I mean, the breaking news of today is that yesterday, SEC sports, fall sports, 3 of them are getting postponed until after August 31st, and those are soccer, cross country, and volleyball. And the SEC wants to make sure that these sports and these athletes can safely return and allow for the proper adjustments in order to lessen the spread of the coronavirus. But nothing has been said yet about football. Do you think that that is an indicator of the lengths that the conference is willing to go to ensure that we do have a football season?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think it definitely shows where sort of football is on the priority list. I think the fact that they haven't made any big decisions yet is encouraging in some way to know that they're still definitely trying to exhaust any option regarding all of the fall sports. Just because, of course, this is going to be a modified schedule if it does happen. But long term, I'm not feeling super optimistic about football because the athletes, football, lacrosse, no, sorry, not lacrosse, but football, soccer, any fall sport, they are students first. And so whatever ends up happening from like a state or a university level will also impact them as well. And we've seen what happened with the NBA bubble. Like they spent an insane amount of money to try to curate this safe environment. Literally the media people had to be tested 7 times before they were like allowed to like enter and stuff like that. So they literally exhausted every resources, but 2 of the players still tested positive. So at the end of the day, it is a virus. We can't really beat it. So I think we'll know something like the SEC commissioner said, like late July. I think there is some positives, and knowing that they haven't made a decision yet, it's not like where Ivy League canceled, all fall sports. I would expect them to announce something along the lines of doing a conference-only schedule. I think that's definitely a possibility. But regarding what the stadium's going to look like, what fans are going to look like, what the broadcast is going to look like, no one really knows anything. So it'll be interesting to see. There's not a lot of outcomes. Like a lot of the outcomes are sort of like a lose-lose situation, because on one hand it's like, do we go into the fall sort of making sure everyone's aware of the liabilities, but we just go, not business as usual, but still have fans in the stadium, still have the players, an attempt to, have those TV contracts and stuff like that. Because at the end of the day, there is a big financial aspect of how they're going to make these decisions. However, knowing that they're going to put a lot of people at risk and stuff like that. Or do we just say, it's just not going to happen sort of deal, which would upset a lot of people and jeopardize a lot of the student athletes sort of like future, we're talking like NFL prospects too.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just not a lot of good outcomes. I'm sure whatever ends up happening, people are not going to be happy about it. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see.
Yeah, like you said, so many, unfortunately, of these outcomes are lose-lose situations, and all of these conference leaders are looking to minimize the risks associated with playing, but unfortunately, until there's a vaccine, there's always going to be a risk. And like you said, that could have long-term effects. I know that some of the cases that have been reported, they may seem fine and be asymptomatic now, but they could pose health problems down the road. And if they're athletes and they're looking to go pro, that's a huge issue, and that would affect their career and the rest of their lives. But just yesterday, Hall of Fame coach Lou Holtz said that the virus rules and regulations make it virtually impossible to have college football this season. Specifically, like I said, I mean, the risk associated is just incredibly high right now. Over 100 players have tested positive at some point. Many programs have had to put a pause on their preseason workouts. Like you mentioned earlier, Big Ten, Pac-12, Ivy League, Patriot League, all of those conferences have had to make major changes. But if by some small chance football is the only sport that goes on this fall, do you think that, I mean, you did mention most people are not going to be happy about whatever happens because you just can't please everyone. But do you think that many of the other sports would consider that unfair, or do you think it's smart to prioritize football since that's such a big moneymaker for so many schools?
I just I really I don't think it's fair if they I mean I understand from like a resource wise if they're like we don't have enough resources to put all of our efforts into every single sport, but I just don't think that's fair to the other programs, to the student athletes. That's not really what Auburn's about. And so if there was a situation where they said only football because financially this is what brings in the most revenue, I think that would be disappointing, at least for me to see that they wouldn't exhaust all of these resources for every other athlete as well. But like you were saying, talking about Lou Holtz and stuff, it's just you start going to the what ifs and stuff. How are they going to keep the we'll just use all sports for example, how are they going to keep all of the athletes safe? You know, what happens if some of them test positive in South Don, like they're all standing together and stuff like that? And then what happens if half of the A&M team comes down with it and then we have to reschedule the A&M game and stuff like that? Or a really prominent player gets it and then they want to power through because they don't have a lot of symptoms and we need said player to play in order to win, but then that imposes the risk of them jeopardizing and giving it to all the other teammates and the opposing teams. It's a lot of what ifs and it's a lot of factors to think about. So yeah.
There are a lot of factors, and like you mentioned, conference only play, I think there's a strong likelihood that that will be the go-to option this season. For those sports that have been postponed, it's up to the individual schools to schedule those non-conference exhibition games and non-exhibition games that are getting either canceled or having to be rescheduled. And I think that a lot of those schools are just going to end up just crossing it off and not trying to reschedule it and just dealing with the outcome without it, because it is, like you said, if half the team happens to come down with it, then whoever they've practiced with or talked to or been with in the past, like who knows how many days, they're going to have to be quarantined for several weeks. And then it would really create a domino effect. I mean, like one person might have it and show signs, but there could still be 10 other players who don't show signs, which is what makes it so worrisome that the effects of this virus could have, and it could wreak havoc, especially not only on the big college football programs, but also the smaller ones whose football is their main source of revenue. And that if they don't have football at all, that's what the conference only schedules are going to hurt. Is lots of schools scheduled those games, some like consider them the cupcake games, like last year when Auburn played Samford right before the Iron Bowl. They paid Samford lots of money to come to Jordan-Hare and really just to keep them fresh. And for Samford, it was a way to make money, but that helps Samford so much financially. And with those conference only games, these smaller schools are not going to have the opportunity to make their necessary revenue and profits.
Right. I mean, I think we've already seen it with not Stanford, but Stanford cutting a lot of their sports. I totally agree. Smaller schools, there's definitely going to be some sports teams that get totally cut just because they don't have enough revenue to keep them going. I wouldn't be surprised if even some of the bigger schools, maybe some spring sport that doesn't bring in a lot, that they're going to have to go ahead and make the sort of executive decision that with how much we're going to lose this year. They also, all the athletic departments also, especially like all the basketball schools, we lost a lot in the spring too from March Madness and all of that ad revenue and all that craziness not happening. So it's definitely sort of have to think long term and what we need to sort of keep going financially. It's also different than the pro league because we don't have this sort of student athlete obligation. Because then this sort of dives into the whole question of these athletes aren't getting paid, but then they're literally bringing in so much money. And are we going to put them at a higher risk than we would any other student just to keep the athletic department afloat? And so it's sort of like a double-edged sword sort of there with the whole notion of that these athletes aren't getting paid, but they're a big source of income for the school, and how much is a university willing to put their student athletes at risk? So yeah, it's a lot of sort of moral, ethical stuff as well, which I think is interesting to talk about.
Yeah, it really is. And you mentioned the money making aspect of it all. I mean, last year, the fiscal year for Auburn, football and men's basketball were the top two money makers. They accounted for over 70% of the athletic department's revenue. And both sports made more than they did the year prior. And like you mentioned, this past spring in 2020, obviously their revenue is going to go down because basketball took such hard losses they weren't able to go to the conference tournament or the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
But at Auburn, football and men's basketball are the only two NCAA sports to be considered revenue earners. And the rest of Auburn's programs operated at a loss of more than $29 million combined, which I think is very worrisome numbers, especially, like you mentioned, those Stanford program cuts. And Auburn has an average number of varsity programs, so it's not like they're stretched too thin, but it still provides the thought that we could lose some big sport that might not be a huge moneymaker, but it's super important to the culture of Auburn, to the players who sign here, and to the students and the fans who go to those events. Are there any sports that come to mind that specifically worry you?
Well, I would just think off the top of my head, I would say maybe tennis. I'm going to be honest, I did not grow up an Auburn fan for these people, so I'm not super familiar with the Auburn sort of sports legacy. Um, but tennis, swimming, and diving, we've had a pretty strong program. I know it hasn't been as good in the most recent years. But tennis, and then maybe golf, that comes to mind too. Not really sure. It'll be interesting. I also would be curious if it's like a SEC wide cut, if that makes sense. Because, like, for example, SEC doesn't have men's soccer or something like that, where it's like one school cuts said program and then they all are, because then they don't have enough people to play and stuff like that. But for some reason, the spring sports is what comes to mind. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if they made a decision about that.
Yeah, and you brought up an interesting point about an SEC wide cut, and I think that would, if they had to make any cuts, that could potentially be the way to go, just because then it would kind of even the field throughout the conference. But like you mentioned, spring sports are what come to my mind as well. I feel like fall is obviously mostly football, and then like those three that got postponed are thrown in there. But in the spring, it's mostly about basketball, and obviously the end of winter um, is what basketball season takes up. But like you mentioned, I mean, softball, they've been on the rise. They've got some good names, especially this next year after those spring sports were granted an extra year of eligibility. They should look to be pretty successful, which hopefully that will prevent them from getting cut. But I know that a lot of people, it may not be as crowded as, say, a baseball game, but there are regular fans who attend pretty much every Auburn event. I know that I've been to softball games, and there's the guy in the helmet who's always leading the stands and the cheers, and he's at every single softball game. And so there are still fans who are loyal to these sports who would be drastically affected if they happen to get cut.
Yeah, and luckily for softball, SEC is pretty strong. I mean, not as strong as like Pac-12. Like Big 12 always has some good teams. So hopefully that will sort of keep us going. But volleyball, for example, Vanderbilt doesn't have a volleyball team. Fun fact. So, there is some unbalance with there. But I wouldn't be surprised though if some spring. And then then again, this is just such a good conversation to have because then it brings in the whole Title IX. Because if you cut a women's
Right.
then like what's going to happen with that scholarship money, and then you have to dive into that whole deal. So I feel like if they cut one, they'd have to cut a men's and a women's.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's such a good point because that's one of the aspects that Stanford analyzed when they were deciding which programs to cut, because they had to make sure that they were still in compliance with those Title IX regulations. And like you said, I mean, softball, I doubt it's going to get cut because then that would mean that a men's sport would have to. And obviously they're not going to cut baseball, not that those are exactly at the same level. But if you cut, say, women's golf, then men's golf might have to go. Or if you cut softball, then there'd be an imbalance if you had to cut, say, men's tennis.
Right.
Like, I think that Auburn shouldn't have too much to worry about because, like we mentioned before, they have 18 or 19 varsity programs. So that's about the average number. They're not stretched too thin. Even though most of them do operate at a loss, the football and the men's basketball aspects of department revenue account for a lot of that, which is reassuring.
Yeah, and luckily there is such a strong sort of family communal culture about athletics at Auburn. And like you were talking about earlier, there's people that really do buy into the whole, we're not just here for Auburn football. Like we love all Auburn sports. And so hopefully once sports resumes at some point back to some normalcy, that there'll be a really sort of big surge, big increase in, revenue and tickets and all that stuff because everyone will be so thankful. But yeah, it'll be interesting. I bet there are going to be a lot of the development office, a lot of alumni asking for donors, like, hey, can we endow this fund for this team? Because, so it'll be interesting how the university sort of goes to combat all of the indefinite revenue loss from craziness of right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned a really good point about the potential surge of fans in attendance at these events. And I mean, I know my first sporting event I ever covered was softball, so that's kind of close to my heart. And I was able to go to a couple last year, but it's just there's so much uncertainty with this virus that it's already making me plan for going to as many events as I can because who knows, this was so out of the blue, and hopefully it will be resolved very soon. But one last question. Do you think that Auburn will do the limited fan capacity in the stadium, or do you think that no fans is going to be their final decision?
Okay, I think it's going to be no fans because I don't see a situation where they have some sort of limited fan capacity in the stadium and then they continue. I think if they allow fans in the stadium, then they won't be able to play a full season because cases are going to get too high and stuff like that. But this is where the question is, okay, so if they don't allow fans in the stadium, then people are still going to gather, at people's houses or at bars, unfortunately, which we know is sort of a hot spot for cases and stuff like that. So would having no fans in the stadium prevent the rise? I think yes, because then that entails that there's not going to be tailgates or anything like that too. But my humble opinion, again, I don't really know that much, is if they want to play a whole season, they would have to have no fans.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you. And at this point, I'll be happy for any football, hoping that it happens. I'd give up being there as long as I would be able to watch it in some form. And I'm sure so many people feel that same way. And like you said, even if hopefully no fans will reduce tailgating and keep people watching it with maybe people that live with or their quarantine people and group of friends, but hopefully we have football of some form in the fall. We will know a decision maybe in 2 weeks, late July, hopefully. But thank you so much for joining me today, Amanda. I'm Delaney Barrow, and this was Sports Night in Quarantine.